So I turned 27 at the end of this month, and here's the truth: I don't have everything figured out. I don't know if I've done a good job so far in this life, and I don't really know what I want out of this life ultimately. And honestly, I feel a lot of people in their 20s are having the same crisis or having the same thoughts as me. And I just wanted to share my perspective on it and maybe encourage some of the other people in their 20s that they're not doing so bad, or maybe not to compare themselves to others. I feel a big problem is we live in a world that people still think we're in the same world or generation as our parents, especially when it comes to our 20s, my parents, at least, my dad was already in a career. He owned a business. My mom was a stay at home. So they weren't making tons of money, but they were making good money for back then to have four children. They built the house down here. They had the car. They had two cars. Obviously they were married. They had the four children, and all of it just seemed to line up for them. And I think a lot of people in their generation. But in today's generation, while I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom, it's just not the same. Like, it's not reality now, especially just the cost of living going up, just the cost of everything, honestly, just going up, especially houses. Like, this generation is just having such a harder time to buy real estate, to buy their first home, to buy their forever home. And, most people like myself still, we're just figuring things out as we go. And, I feel that's exactly what your 20s are for. I think our parents, just may have had it a little too good or a little too easy, where, hey, they didn't have the social media where they were being motivated to start their own business or, quit that 9 to 5. They were just told, hey, get a solid job, find a woman or a man, to settle down with, have kids with, and, kind of just live the American dream, I guess is what was pitched back then. And, as I was just explaining before, I mean, the timeline myth that our parents got to live, but not necessarily us, or maybe, isn't pushed as much for this generation. You're told to, graduate high school, maybe go to college, graduate college, land a career, land a job, buy a house, find that lucky lady or lucky guy, get married, have kids, retire, and that's it. You left you led a successful life, I guess. And that may work for some people still, but most of us, I think, based on social media or just seeing how other people live their life, life just doesn't follow that script for a lot of us, and it really just depends on what you're trying to get out of your life. Some people don't find their careers until they're 30s. Some people travel for years before they, quote unquote, settle down with somebody, or, settle down at a location, state, country, whatever the case may be. Some live at home, raising my hand right here, to save money. Some people consider that smart and resourceful, others shameful. I mean, I guess to each their own. The idea that there's one right way or one right timeline is just false. And I think you saw that timeline a lot with our parents. They usually stuck to that one thing, find someone, settle down, buy a house, have kids. There you go. Like that's their life. Sure, it sounds like a very nice life. Maybe I'd like to achieve that one day, find someone to settle down with, buy a forever home, have children there, and, raise them at that home with the significant other. And other times, you may just want to vacation a little bit, or you may want to kind of live different places. I think the world is your oyster there, and you weren't really told that back then. You were told, get the job, settle down, have kids, retire, and, keep going, I guess. I don't think this next tip necessarily pertains only to your 20s, but it's definitely a big part of your 20s. Your 20s are less about perfection and more about trial and error. You're going to mess up jobs. You're going to land a job where you may not necessarily enjoy, or maybe it kind of sparks like, oh, wow, I want to try this type of job. I don't like the job that I got out of college. Mess up relationships, meet new people, especially how we're just connected around the world. Back then, you typically you would just kind of marry like a high school sweetheart or someone in your town, like a local person. But now, with social media, you can connect with someone in a whole different country, and hasn't been my situation by any means, but you can connect to someone in a different country. You can take a trip out there, you guys fall in love, you get married, and you move out of the country, or he or she moves into this country, whatever the case is. You have that ability in today's world. You can experience new relationships, that people back then just never did, because we weren't as connected, especially through the internet. You make mistakes with money, whether it be investing in, a meme coin, or, starting a little side business with a buddy and it completely flops. I guess, we're more willing to take more risks now, instead of back then, where, like I said, you would be at the same job for 30, 40 years. You'd get the pension, you'd retire, and, everything would be all hunky dory. But now I think more people are willing to, well, hey, let's try something new. You never know what clicks, and maybe you won't have to be at a job for 30, 40 years, building up your like retirement egg. And that's all okay. I think that change of mindset, like I said, you don't have to change. You can do the whole, I'll work somewhere 30, 40 years, I'll invest my money smartly, and I'll be able to invest or retire a millionaire. Or you can try new things. There's people making millions of dollars, playing video games, or talking on a podcast. And sometimes like my parents will be like, "Oh, Mike," I'm like, "Yeah, this kid plays video games for a living and makes millions of dollars a month or a year," and it just boggles their mind sometimes. Like there's just so many opportunities in today's world that wasn't offered back then. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Back then it sounds easier. Hey, you get a job, you work there your whole life, and you're done. Compared to here, it's like, oh, well, you might get laid off. You might work here for 2 years, might jump here for 3 years, or who knows, you might stream video games for a living and make a bunch of money. I feel like ultimately, the 20s, your 20s, it's the decade where you learn what works for you, and just as important, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what you want out of life. I think you start to develop that in your 20s, and every failure you take right now actually sets you up for long-term success, because you're learning lessons you'll carry with you, and you're learning things you don't want to do or you don't like, and you can obviously pivot away from those. With the world being so well connected now, especially through the internet, comparison comes up a lot, and comparison will kill your joy. Social media especially, makes it look like everyone your age is buying houses, driving Teslas, getting married, starting multi-million-dollar businesses. But remember, people only post their highlight reels, guys, or like, take another example. People aren't going to post the photo that makes them look fat or makes them look ugly, or, girl doesn't have her makeup on. They're going to post the highlights. They looked really good one night. They just got their hair cut done. They just got a makeover. They just hit big on the Bitcoin or the meme coin or whatever. They don't show you the debt they have, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty behind the scenes, the failures, the flops. And, if you're always comparing yourself to someone else's path, I feel you'll miss the progress you're making on your own. And, obviously, comparing yourself, it's human nature. I feel a little bit is good. It's motivating. But when you just strictly focus on other people's success, and you're just thinking like poor you, and you're just always complaining that someone has it better, you'll never be happy when you achieve something positive in your life. You'll just constantly try to compare yourself. Well, it could have been this much better because that guy's project was this much better, or he made that much more money, whatever it is. And just pretty much just remember, you'll miss the progress you're making on your own, and at the end of the day, your path, that's the one that really only matters in life, your path. So here's a reminder I want to share with everybody, and to constantly remind myself. Nobody really has it all figured out in their 20s. Even the people who look like they do, they're most likely struggling with something behind the curtains. Maybe they're not necessarily struggling with the same issue you are, but I feel everyone has their own battles that they're going through in life. And you don't need to have the perfect career, perfect relationship, perfect finances, especially in your 20s. I think we're all still growing up, we're all still learning, Yes, we're considered adults at that age, but deep down, I still feel like a kid, deep down, I can have, I don't know, chicken nuggets and macaroni for dinner, or, I can sit and play video games for hours on end. But you just need to keep moving forward, keep growing, and trust that things come together as you go. And, maybe one day, it'll just kind of snap in your head, hey, like, this is what I want out of this life. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to achieve. And then after that, like, you're golden, and you just keep grinding and you'll get there for sure. So if you're in your 20s and you feel lost, you feel behind, you're not behind, you're not failing, you're just living life at your own pace, and that's okay. We all achieve goals, at a different age. Maybe we don't share the same goals, whatever the case is. So I don't think you guys are behind. Like I said, you'll hit different strides at different ages, and that's okay. If we all hit the same goal, the same age, same time, it would be a pretty boring world. Just be cookie cutter humans. So I'm wrapping it up here, guys. If this video gave you something to think about, feel free to hit the like button, feel free to hit the subscribe, and feel free to share it with a friend who might need the reminder, or let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section. And as always, guys, the lunch table out.